Snow had fallen in the night and found every crack. It smoothed the gouges in Winterfell's inner yard, and softened the broken stones the masons had prized loose and stacked along the ramparts. It made the new palisade seem older and the old godswood younger. Laid white hands upon red leaves until each drop of color looked like a heart's blood pricked to the surface and frozen there in the first breath of morning. When Sansa rose, the sky was the blue of hammered steel, thin and bright, and the light that came through her shutters was a cold, clean blade. She listened to it before she opened her eyes, the way the castle sounded. Boots under the archway, a woman's voice scolding a child, the thin mew of a hungry cat. Even the ravens on the rookery had a winter note to them, a brittleness. It felt honest. For once, the sound matched the shape the place made in her mind. She dressed herself. She did not call for help, as she had once done in a city where girls were trussed like birds for feast days. She laced the bodice by feel and tied off the cords with steady fingers and drew the wool over her shoulders so the nap lay all one way. In the bronze mirror she saw a woman with hair like a living banner and a small white scar along the hairline above her temple that no one bothered to pretend not to see. The scarf at her throat had been worked in pearled thread to make the direwolf's eye catch at a certain angle. She had overseen the stitching herself and pricked her own finger twice to teach the seam that she meant what she said. The yard made a hush under the snow. She crossed it without lifting her hem too high, because there was a dignity to winter you learned only by living in it. And she would rather let the wet creep to her ankles than go minced and quick, as if she meant to flee. Men paused as she went by, not to gape or to praise, but because a lady of Winterfell in her own yard altered the air. She could feel it, that widening of attention around her. Loyalty was warmer than any fur when it was earned rather than traded. In the godswood, the heart tree had made a little red world of itself. The snow took what the weirwood let fall and built a shrine to the color of blood. Sansa knelt without grace or ceremony. There were prayers she could not say and would not, and there were others that rose to meet her without words. She placed her palm on the rough skin of the trunk and let the cold through. There had been a time when she thought of songs while she prayed, court songs with pretty steps. In this place she thought of the way ice formed filigree along the eaves, of the smell of iron and wet leather, of a boy's hand on a sword hilt and the breath that clouded from him. Sometimes when the world was very still, she thought she could feel the press of an old gaze from within the tree, not judging and not tender, simply there. On the way back to the keep, she heard the horn, not the hunting call, not the alarm, not the little fanfare the cooks favored when bread came out browned and crackling. This was a low, clear note from the outer gate, the sort that asked for attention but not fear. At the top of the stairs to the battlements, she slowed so as not to make the guard's captain, who followed at a distance out of habit now more than command, feel she meant to outrun him. The captain was a grizzled man with Southron service in his past that he wore like an old wound. He seldom spoke unless asked and had never once told her she shouldn't do the thing she had already decided to do. They reached the wall walk as the gatehouse chain creaked. The portcullis teeth kissed each bar with a sound like a blacksmith laying tools to rest. Through the murder holes in the long, narrow mouth of the gate, a caravan moved. 3 sledges drawn by ponies that did not care to be north of the neck. 6 men with the measured step of soldiers who had tried too many boots. And in their midst, a wagon without wheels, a low platform on runners, overbuilt as if to carry stone. No banners. No colors she knew. The lead man raised his arms to show he bore no weapon. He was broad in the middle and spare at the joints in a way older men sometimes were when they had spent youth at a desk and middle age in places where a desk would not fit. His hair had thinned to fine ash, combed carefully to cover a shiny spot, as if a little vanity had outlasted a larger one. He wore gray wool without a chain at his throat, but there was an air to him, a many-roomed quiet, like a library no one had visited for years that still remembered hands. "Who calls?" the captain barked. Because some forms were bones in a body. Remove them and things fell in. "Qyburn," the man answered in a voice gentle as a midwife's, and Sansa felt the name move through her blood before her mind allowed it. It carried heat with it, the kind that comes not from flame but from fever. She saw Brienne coming across the yard, with her long strides that always startled until you remembered a woman could be tall. The snow took less notice of Brienne than of other folk. It did not dare slush at her boots. Her cloak was the color of winter cloud, and showed the stitches where it had been let out at shoulder and hip since she had come north. Podrick trailed 3 paces behind, earnest and earnest-eyed, as if every stone were a thing with a lesson. "Do you know the man?" the captain asked without looking away from the gate. "I know the name," Sansa said. There were nights when the old city came back to her in bits. The feel of marble underfoot, and the smell of sweet wine that had turned, and the particular weight of silk veils on the bridge of the nose. Small bits of talk. A strong hand on her arm while men in armor shouted. A woman's laugh that had no daylight in it. Qyburn had been a murmur then, a breath that stirred the edge of horror. He had been said to make things live that should not and to quiet things that should speak. Now he stood with his hands exposed to the cold, his fingers pale, but only as much as an old man's might be. He looked up at the battlement and made the smallest bow a man could make, and still have it count. "I bring no threat," he called. "I bring a gift and a plea, which sometimes amount to the same thing." The men on the sledges kept their eyes very carefully anywhere but on the wagon at their center. "Let him in," Sansa said, and heard the whisper of it along the stones. The captain did not look at her, which was courtesy. He signaled with one hand, and the gate finished its groaning days. They met in the yard where the snow held itself like breath. Qyburn went to his knees as if joints could remember humility without telling the brain first. He remained there long enough to count for more than show. When he rose, there was not even the pretense of a chain at his throat, and the collarbones showed sharp under the wool. "You were expelled," Sansa said. The words came out flat and faded, like text rubbed thin in a ledger one keeps for obligation's sake. "They took your chain," they said. The rest did not need saying. She was a Stark, a woman of the North. She did not need to speak every rot she knew to prove she knew it. "Chains are heavy," Qyburn said pleasantly, as if he mocked himself first. "Some throats take to them better than others. My lady, I have come a long way. The South is a place where ideas burn. Fire leaps in ways no one expects. Old cities do not so much fall as learn they have been falling for years. I have done ill things and good, and most often things in between, which are the most dangerous sort." He made the smallest gesture with one gloved hand. "I served a queen. The city I served in is about to arm itself with its own fear and call it godly. I can smell such moments as a hound smells meat." "You served Cersei," Sansa said. "Queens are made of circumstance as much as blood," Qyburn said dryly. "I served the office, and the opportunity it offered for inquiry. That opportunity has soured. I am here because you will understand both inquiry and winter, and because I bring a sword you may use." Mendshanawan. Brienne came to stand at Sansa's shoulder like a stone that had grown there overnight. "What sort of sword?" she said, and her hand lay easy at the hilt of the long blade she wore. The blade Sansa had asked to see every fortnight, so she could learn its thirst and its patience. Qyburn did not answer at once. He turned and made a sign to his men. The 6 in brown moved without speaking, and Sansa noted the way their eyes slid from the wagon, as if it offended them that they had to pretend they were not afraid. They took a tarpaulin by its corners and lifted it with care more suited to a babe. Beneath it lay white, white as the fresh skin of the yard, white to the nails. It was armor of a sort she had seen in the South, all smooth curved plates and glossy enamel, made to shine on a sunny day like a god's tooth. But no enamel ever came so chalk pure. It drank the light and gave it back colder. There were 7 stars embossed on the breast where a device might go, but they were not painted. They seemed to have been made by taking light away. Between the joints, what should have been leather was something else, a material like stiffened linen or thin vellum. The helm lay beside it, a thing with a slit thin as a knife wound. She could not tell if it had been built to fit a man, or if a man had been made to fit it. Brienne took 1 step forward and 1 step back. "Sir Robert Strong," Qyburn said. He said it as one might say a word of a dead language to a child, and watched to see if the child recognized it from a story. "He has worn that white for a short time, but he understands old vows. He will swear them again to whom you wish, if you wish." Ben? In? No. Men came running then who had no right to run. Men who commanded other men, and did not show their haste if they could help it. The murmuring began. Sansa knew the taste of murmuring as she knew the taste of iron. There was a scent under the snow's purity now. Sweet, a syrup scent. Something that had been poured too freely to cover rot, and only taught you to expect both at once. Where did you get Cersei's champion? Brienne asked, simple as an axe. Qyburn smiled without his lips. The faith has turned against certain amusements, he said. They would deny a trial its proper music. A queen may rule with fear and be feared by those who ride for her, but fear turns its cloak quickly when it smells incense. I have found that swords meant to be used lose their temper, if left too long in show. I removed a piece from the board before priests who called themselves sparrows learned how to play with it. So you stole him, the captain said. He sounded like a man tasting brine, and thought it wise to bring what you stole to a Stark. I thought it wise to bring him where winter means something, Qyburn said, and where a lady's life has been played with enough for her to wish to set her own rules. Sansa looked at the armor as if it might answer the questions it posed. The yawning mouth of the helm returned her look without eyes. The men who had drawn off the tarp shifted their weight, as if their boots had found a seam of ice beneath the snow. On the wagon's far side, a pony shook its head and snorted, and the sound was impossibly loud. She could feel Brienne's attention like a held breath. What does he eat? Sansa asked. Qyburn cocked his head, almost delighted. Less than one might think, he said. But he stands long watches and never flags. He does not drink unless given. He does not speak. He is obedient to commands he receives from the one to whom he has sworn. He has taken no bride and will take none. He will hold no lands. He is a sword when a sword is needed, and a wall when a wall is demanded, and a shadow when caution is called for. He will serve until he is broken. He is hard to break. Ben? D. The old city rose again, sudden as a knife popping through cloth. Courtyards washed in sunlight as hot as honey. Boys in dyed silks, laughing. A smell in the passageways like willow bark boiled too long, and a woman's perfume laid over it until it turned sickly. She had seen a head on a spear once against that bright blue sky. She had watched a man's mouth move and sound not come. She had been told too many times that there were gifts she did not understand and duties she had not earned. This was different. It had to be, or else all the careful stitches she had made since coming home would pull loose with one sharp tug. You bring him to me to purchase your own safety, Sansa said. You bring him because you think the North will hide you from a South you made dangerous for yourself. Qyburn's eyes softened, and that was the worst thing about him, that he could feel a thing like pity without altering his shape. I bring him because you are not safe, he said simply. No lady is, but most do not know it. You do. I bring him because men who come in the night do not stop coming because you have a wall. I bring him because there is a hunger down in the South that will wander when it has finished eating its own, and it will come for new bread. I bring him because I have made a great many errors, and in the counting of them, wish to lay one thing down where it might be used for the good of someone who would know what good looked like. Man. It was almost skillful, the way he spoke. Almost true, which was worse than false. Sansa felt the bite of the air in her lungs and the rasp of wool along her wrists. She pictured herself saying no, and imagined the looks, the relief and the fear, and the scorn all braided in a rope. She pictured herself saying yes, and felt the rope too, tugged around her waist, drawing her toward one more southern knot. Then she pictured the godswood, how the weir wood regarded without blinking. She had learned to imagine the tree watching when she made certain choices. She thought of that, and the rope untied itself. He will swear, she said, but not in your way, not in the yard, not with a septon's mutter. He will swear where oaths are heard. Qyburn dipped his head. As you wish. And you will abide, if you mean what you say, Sansa added. You will submit to the old laws. You will tell what you know when asked. You will not ply your inquiries without leave. If a mother comes to me for justice and your name is on her breath, I will give her justice, and you will not like its color." The faintest tremor ran through his hands before he steadied them in his sleeves. "As you wish," he said again. And if there were humor in it now, it was the gallows sort. They prepared the god's wood as if for a wedding. That was how it felt. A joining, the binding of two names with words and a garment, and the knowledge that something would grow out of the knot, tied today. The women who prize stitches came at once to Sansa's look. She did not need to speak. Old Lysa, whose hips had delivered 6 babes and carried none to manhood but who put her tenderness into linen, brought bolts of white wool stored for the day a bride would be decked in winter's color. It had a nap like frost under the sun. The girls set to cutting it as Sansa had taught them to, not with long thoughtless snips, but with a steadied blade and a sparing hand. Brienne came and measured, and said nothing when Sansa asked her to bring the Kingsguard cloak from a chest where it had lain since Sir Roderick brought it north after the rebellion. It had been a trophy once, taken from a dead man at the side of a river, choked with armor and horses. It smelled of cedar where it had slept with the moths. Sansa did not touch that cloak. She looked at it, and then away. It was too much southern story in one piece of cloth. Instead, she set the white wool down and chose fur from a coat flayed off a white bear far to the northeast, bought with salt and iron and a song, and she ordered it placed along the hem. She pricked her finger again, deliberately this time, and let a single drop make a small, honest stain at the fold where the collar would sit. She told no one why. She told herself it was to make the seam remember a woman's blood had made it, not a tailor's boast. When they bore the armor through the yard, men stepped back because of the size of it and because of the quiet around it. No jingle, no rattle, no perfume on the air now, only that strained sweetness under the snow's clarity. The boys all craned their necks. The kitchen cat hissed, and then quieted all at once, as if it had recalled it was supposed to keep mice from thinking the place belonged to them. Podrick kept glancing to Sansa, as if he thought he should ask a thing but feared to make it into something that could be answered. In the God's Wood, bare branches wrote their black script on the sky. The heart tree made the world look small around it. Sansa took the white cloak from the women's hands and bore it herself. It was heavier than she expected, as vows are. Qyburn kept his distance with the discretion of a man who had learned the cost of being near important moments, and was still drawn to them. "Is this wise?" Brienne asked softly as they came to the tree. Her voice was a low door on a long hinge. "Nothing is," Sansa said. "That is why we make vows." She took her place beneath the red chalk eyes. The kneeling place had been used for 1,000 years by 1,000 kneelers. The ground knew what to do. The men arranged the armor on the snow and then stepped away as if they'd set a trap. Qyburn made a small motion with his hand, an instruction so deft you might have missed it if you hadn't been watching him the way Sansa watched him. From the wagon's shadow stepped a man in a rough brown cloak that made him into a lump of wood. He put his hands, long hands with pale hairs along the fingers, under the breastplate and lifted it as easily as if he were removing a child's nightshirt. Underneath lay not empty straw, as Sansa had half thought, but flesh grayed by winter, and something else. A body, a man's torso with its ribs rising under the skin like bones in snow, and a head wrapped in linen stained faintly yellow where a mouth would be. The absence of scent was suddenly a presence. There was no smell of rot. There was the old sweet only. Sansa did not let herself take a step back. She had learned to choose her movements the way a player chooses lines in a scene you cannot change. The brown-cloaked man set the armor aside and made 3 quick, practiced cuts at laces Sansa could not see. And then what had been wrapped was unwrapped, and a shape got to its knees. It was too large. That was all the mind could say at first. Too large, as if someone had inflated a man with a bellows. The skin had no hair, none at wrist or forearm or cheek. The face was a blank, a smooth, bald slope where black stubble should have been. The eyes were closed. The mouth was hidden by the cloth. There was a livid bruise around the throat, like a necklace from a jealous lover. He rose as the armor was put back upon him. The brown-cloaked man fitted each piece as if he had been taught by the man who made it, with touches that found holes without looking. The arms went on, and the greaves and the plates that guarded the tender groin. When the helm was put in place, the slit stared at nothing and everything at once. He knelt then. He knelt so slowly the snow had time to make up its mind about him and decide to accept his weight. He knelt until the white of him seemed a second statue under the red-eyed tree. Brienne drew her sword, not to threaten but to sanctify. It was a good blade, honest steel with the nick in the fuller that always troubled Podrick, and never Brienne. She planted it point down in snow hard as board and stood behind it, her hands on the pommel, her breath steaming like a prayer without words. Sansa spoke, and her voice did not tremble. "You will swear as the white swords swear," she said. "But you will give your oath to the Lady of Winterfell, and to the house that bears the wolf. You will defend me and mine, and you will defend those that seek guest right in my hall. You will keep my counsels and my secrets when they are mine to keep, and you will speak me truth when I ask for it, for the white cloak is a truth, not a veil. You will take no wife and father, no children, and hold no lands. Your life will go before mine. Your sword will turn before mine. You will obey the old laws that bind this place, and you will not take blood where it is not owed. If you break this oath, may the gods you believe in turn their faces away." There was a stillness that wrapped the tree and the sky and the white thing kneeling and the woman who spoke. And in that stillness, a raven on the far branch made a sound like a dropped bead. Qyburn's breath made the faintest fog. "Do you swear?" Sansa asked. He could not answer. That had been said. Yet something answered. The great helm bowed. The big hands moved, gauntleted, and laid the long sword on the snow, edge away, as if offering the blade to the tree to judge. He spread his hands then and placed them palm down in the snow, as if to show the earth his fingers. The gesture was not in any Southron ceremony Sansa had ever known, but it felt older than the white paint on the armor. She felt it in the skin along her arms. She stepped forward and set the white cloak on his shoulders. The fur brushed the enamel and did not burn. She felt the weight come onto her hands, and it was like settling a millstone on a pillar. Dangerous, necessary. For a moment her fingers brushed the hard curve where a neck should give under skin. It did not give. "Rise," she said. He rose. The tree watched. The men breathed. Brienne lifted her blade free of the snow and laid it against her shoulder, as if the ceremony had made it heavier and truer. Afterward, as men do after anything that demands they pretend to awe, there were questions and laughter pitched too high, and bets made about how long the southerner who brought the southerly thing would last. Qyburn accepted a place in a storage room above the buttery, with the air of a prince granted a pavilion in a field of rugs. Sansa gave orders that no one was to bait him, and that he was to have a boy to run messages, and no more. She set strong, if that was a name and not a joke, on the outer door of her chamber the first night. Brienne did not like it, but Brienne did not say so, which Sansa knew meant she did not like it very much indeed. He stood. That was what he did. He stood with his face to the corridor, and his sword sheathed, and his hands easy at his sides, and he did not move except to turn his helm when the torch guttered and needed seeing. The third time Sansa peered from her door to study him, he turned his helm as if to say, "I see you." It was not a threat, and it was not comfort. It said only that there was no thing that passed in that corridor that the slit did not measure. That night, she dreamed of King's Landing, not of singers or of gardens or of a queen's smile like the sheen on a snake. She dreamed of stone warmed too hot by the sun, and the way a body smells when a room is too small for it. She dreamed of a tower where she had once been taught to be good. When she woke, the cold of Winterfell came to her like a remedy, and she tasted snow under her tongue. She opened the door, and the white knight stood there, not sleeping. She listened. Far off, a wolf howled once, low and conversational, as if telling someone to bring more wood. Sansa shut the door and went back to bed and slept without memory. By morning, the castle had decided to live with him. The children in the yard learned how far they might approach before the helm turned to notice. The kennel master's bitch, a yellow creature with too much wit, settled to lying 3 paces off and staring at him with eyes full of speculation. On the second morning, Sansa found a sparrow had made itself brave on the edge of his cloak. It pecked at a fleck of frost until it had convinced itself it was bread, and flew away disappointed. It comforted her, the sparrow, because sparrows are honest in their foolishness. The men took longer. Men looked up from cards when he passed. They shifted their jokes into lower gear when he came by, not because he would tell, but because the white shape made certain words sound sour in the mouth. Qyburn presented himself after 3 days with a folded parchment sealed with blue wax that bore no crest. Sansa accepted it with a caution that had more to do with his hands than with the seal. He had surgeon's hands, she thought. Something in the way he made space between thumb and forefinger for the thing being handled, as if that space were a cradle. "A letter?" she asked. "From me," he said, smiling. And she had the impulse to hand it back to him sealed and say, "You wrote it, you read it." Instead, she broke the wax and found not lines of pretty script meant to impress, but neat cramped letters like stitches at a thin woman's side. He had written what he would tell her if she were his pupil, and he her master. A list of capacities. He wrote, "Sir Robert can run in full armor farther than a man unarmored in summer, provided the ground is even." He wrote, "He will not tire in the ordinary way, and will not heed a pain as other men heed it. If he is harmed and the harm is not mortal, he will continue until commanded to desist." He wrote, "He retains memory of drills taught to him, and learns new patterns more slowly than a bright boy, and more surely than a dull man." He wrote, "He is obedient to your voice and your hand. There are certain other voices he will heed as well, mine among them, though not if you forbid it." He wrote, "He will not betray you." He wrote, "He is not betrayed in the usual ways." The letter made her colder than the stone underfoot. She put it down and looked at the man who had written it. "What was his name?" she asked. Qyburn did not pretend not to know what she meant. "He has the name you gave him," he said. "Names at birth are for mothers. Names after birth are for work." "What work was his?" Sansa asked, "before you made him into a piece on your board?" Qyburn's face altered so slightly that if you were not watching you would have said it had not changed at all. "He did what he was told," he said. "He was good at it. The world is full of such men. We are grateful for them until we see our reflection in their helmets." "Did he have a brother?" Sansa said, because she could not help herself. "Did he have a mother who made a stew and waited and waited, and he did not come home because he was off doing what someone had told him, and she told herself he would come tomorrow because he had always come on a tomorrow until he did not?" "I imagine he did," Qyburn said softly. "I imagine every man did, even those that spring from the ground like stones." She dismissed him then because there are only so many words you can say to a man who collects facts the way other men collect dogs. In the yard, Strong moved like a banner in windless weather. He did not swagger. He did not make a show of his size. He simply was a great white fact in a place where facts were usually the size of men. The master-at-arms sent a boy to ask whether the White Knight would spar. The helm tilted as if to consider, then nodded. They brought blunted blades and padded tunics and 3 men to test what the White Knight could do. He did not dominate the yard. That was not the word. He abided in it while other men flurried around him like snow. And when a blade came near, he moved in the smallest way necessary to keep it from coming nearer. When he struck once. He seemed as careful of his opponents as a midwife is of a woman's bones. When he laid a lad in the snow, he did it with as little malice as you might push a stool under a child who has grown tired of standing. Brienne watched long and close and said nothing. When at last she took up a blade herself and stepped into the circle, Sansa felt the yard go silent. They came together like 2 truths. Brienne was faster because life had taught her she must be. Strong was inevitable. Brienne slid and struck again. Strong turned, a slow tower, and let the blows skate. When he answered, he did it with a parry that came not at her arms but at her eyes. His helm leaned so the slit took her measure, and his blade rang off hers so exactly that the sound was a bell. After 3 exchanges, Brienne stepped back and gave him a little nod that was worth more than a speech. He did not acknowledge it, and somehow that made it more valuable. "Hell do," Brienne said to Sansa later, and Sansa laughed in her throat before she remembered that laughter before a godswood could feel like spitting in a cup. Word came up the King's Road to them, like a traveler that cannot be kept out. A sept had been filled with men, and the men with swords. A queen had closed her fist, and opened it, and the city had run between. Sparrows had pecked at lions in the dust. Lords who had bent both knee and neck to convenience had found their spines stiffen under incense. Letters arrived under seals that told Sansa she was a lord's lady and ought to be thinking of marriage as a plan, not a fate. And one letter came sealed with the lion's head and the roses of a court where roses were grown under a sun that burned men's skin off clean. It was brief, a scratch from a cat's paw, and it read only, "Return what you have stolen." She folded it once and gave it to Brienne without comment, and Brienne made a face as if she had bitten something that had turned between tooth and tongue. "We stole nothing," Brienne said. "Men like that do not care who packed the chest," Sansa said. "They care who has it now." "Will they come for him?" Brienne asked. "They will think of it," Sansa said. "They will send their thoughts north as men send hawks into the air, and watch the hawks turn back, baffled by the cold." That night, when she walked early, the White Knight walked with her. He did not match her stride. A child would try to match and stumble. He went as he went, and she learned to set her foot, a little sooner or later, so that the sound of them together pleased her. In the yard, the blue light made the snow a thing you could drown in. She asked him a question she knew he could not answer. "Do you remember?" she said. "A river?" The helm turned. She could not say if it was a no or a yes. She remembered the trident, and men in bright enamel, and boys with songs in their mouths, and she remembered that afterward the songs were softer, and the enamel wore a different shine. "In the God's Wood?" she asked him. "Do you dream?" He stood and did not answer, and the tree let a single leaf go, so it landed on his shoulder and stuck there until the cold made a bond between red and white. She found herself speaking to him more in those walks than she meant to any man, and when she realized it, she did not stop. She spoke to the White Knight as she would to the tree, if the tree had the courtesy to be a thing you could take with you into long corridors. She told him of a blue dress that had been made for a girl she had been, and of a song in which the lady's lover turned out to be the wrong man, and she forgave him, because the song demanded forgiveness to make the last verse something you might hum. She told him of the look in a mother's eyes when she thought her child could be restored by saying his name, and of the way a raven's foot prints a little Y shape into new snow. He listened better than most men because he could not perform listening. He had no smiles and no chivalry to lay over his attention. He was a slit and a stillness and a presence, and she learned that sometimes that was more mercy than any storybook ever promised. When the first letter came from the Vale, it came folded in a way she knew at once. Pettier Littlefinger wrote, as if his words had a weight that might squeeze through the paper to poison the reader's hand. He wrote that the Eyrie was mild, and that it would be wise to make friends with summer while there was summer still to be begged. He wrote that he had heard of her new toy, and that toys had a way of biting. He wrote that men who steal queen's swords are king's enemies, and that enemies find the road north longer than the road south. He wrote that he was her true friend, and that a true friend would be willing to help her return what was not hers, so that she might receive what was. She took that letter to the God's Wood, and burned it by the heart tree with a candle she did not ask the septa for. The smoke smelt like cinnamon for a moment, and then like old vellum. Brienne approved without saying so by standing nearby and looking elsewhere. By the end of the fortnight, Strong had not slept. Or rather, if he slept, he did it standing, which in the north passes for bravery or folly, depending on who is watching. Sansa tested him without saying she did. She arranged for the kitchen to drop a pot in the corridor 4 hours before dawn, when most men are sweet fools. He turned his helm before the pot had struck the flagstones. She set a boy to come sobbing down the passage, looking for a lost pup. Strong stood aside and let the boy pass, and then turned his head fractionally, as if counting to see if there were more feet than there were in the sobbing. She ordered a man to come up the stair with a tray and no candle, and set his foot wrong as if by accident. Strong's gauntlet shot out and took the tray and held it level while the man caught himself, and not a cup spilled. The third week, a knife came. Not a man. A knife. It came on a string dropped from the floor above. A foolish attempt. A desperate one. The sort you thwart, and then find you are angrier than if a lord had sent 10 good swords. The knife fell point first toward the place her throat would have been had she been leaving her chamber at that hour. Strong's hand rose and took the knife out of the air by the haft, as if plucking a weed. He held it for Sansa to see, and then folded his fingers slowly around the blade, until the metal sang, and snapped, and fell in dull fragments to the rushes. The man on the floor above ran. He did not get far. The confession sounded like a litany of hunger. A Bolton man, a hard-cased thing. 2 fingers missing from a winter, and a bargain gone wrong. He had thought to make his name again with a deed, and had been paid too little by a whisper. He named no whisperer whose name was not one Sansa already knew. There were too many men of that sort. Men who had been taught that their salvation lay in a single act, the blade narrowly placed. He died under the old law. A man who throws a knife into a lady's hall loses the hand that throws it, and then loses the head that wore the hand. Sansa did not watch. She had seen enough heads part company with the lives they contained. But she listened to the sound the crowd made, and the way the sound spread into the alleys of the castle, and down to the sheepfold, and across the yard to the kennel. Justice makes a noise that dogs understand. Afterward, when night put iron filings in the air, and made men rub their arms for warmth they could not name, Sansa stood at the window, slid a long while. Strong stood in his place. She turned at last. "Do you know mercy?" she said, and the helm did not move. "If I asked it, would you stay your hand?" He did not answer. He could not. Yet she thought, with a certainty that felt like a fact rather than a wish, that if she said the word aloud, his fingers would still as if the command had walked down the bones to them. She did not say it, because mercy is a thing you keep polished by using it at the right times, not by wearing it to a nub. The day the snows came heavy enough to swallow even the sound of boots in the corridor, a raven beat at the rookery window with more fervor than a bird needs. Its message was wrapped in thick oiled skin against wet and sealed again and again as if the hand had trembled. The seal was a sunburst, the wax red. The impression imperfect. It came from Old Town and bore the Citadel's caution in the rhythms of its lines. A plague, they wrote, but not of bodies. A plague of rumors that moved faster than men and set fires before torches reached the wood. They wrote of sellswords gathering around men who could make fear into pay. They wrote of the sea going hard and men speaking of ships that did not come in. They wrote as men write when they are afraid to predict, and Sansa felt the cold take her. The South was tearing itself, and things that tear themselves rarely leave others whole. She went to the yard alone and stood under the piled whiteness. The flakes were fat enough to make a noise when they landed, a purring. She lifted her face and felt the flakes kiss the old scar at her hairline. She thought of a time when she had believed stories, because believing them made the world a place where a girl could move without striking sparks. Now she believed only in stones and in the way snow looks before someone steps into it, and in the sound of a woman's laugh when she knows she is heard. She felt the presence behind her a moment before she heard the small scrape of plate. "Sir Robert," she said without turning. He stood, empty of breath, full of purpose. "We will make new vows," she said softly, so the snow could keep its purr. "Not today, not with witnesses. In the spring, if there is spring. For now we will make a pact you can keep without words. If there is a child at my table, and a blade is raised to me, you will put your body between. If there is a man who says he comes in peace and his eyes say other, you will mark his eyes and tell me without saying. If I say go, you will go. If I say stay, you will stay. If I say stop." The helm inclined. It was a small movement, a human movement. It warmed her in a way that made her ashamed, and then ashamed of the shame. "We will teach the North the shape of a white cloak," she said. "Not a court's toy, not a queen's terror, a wall, a promise. I will not be a queen, and I will not be a toy. I will be a lady they can find in the snow by the sound I make." She turned then, and the snow had limbed him. He looked carved out of the storm. For a heartbeat, she could almost see under the enamel, as if the white had become translucent, and something darker moved within. She blinked, and it was gone. Perhaps it had not been there at all. Perhaps it had been in her, some old folly that wished even monsters to be men, because that was the easier sort of mercy. Brienne came to find her later with cheeks chapped raw and eyes bright from the cold. "There's talk," she said. "The hill clans are sending men to sit at your hearth and say winter words. Manderley's ships are iced in where they sit, and he is sending carts by land. There are sellswords along the King's Road that have turned and are heading back south with their pay still in their purses, which means someone taught them fear. There's a raven from White Harbor too, and the seal is fat with oil. And there are 2 men in the hall who say they have come about your White Knight." "2 men?" Sansa asked. "One Tarly," Brienne said, making the name taste of iron. "One with a kettle for a shield, and more sense than his father ever had. And another with a loose smile and a lord's learning who says he can smell when things don't die properly." She flexed her hands as if they hurt. "I do not like that one." "Few do," Sansa said. They met in the great hall where fires roared and made the tapestries believe themselves alive. The Tarly boy stood stiff and proper with the posture of a man who had been bent 1,000 times and then told to stand, and had forgotten how it felt to be natural. He had a pleasant face that would have been finer if worry didn't pinch it. The other was tall and spare, and wore brown. He looked as if he had given too much of his warmth to the fire, and meaning to take it back. "Lady Stark," the tall one said, "it is good to see the North as a place where courtesy survives the weather." He bowed just deep enough to be proper without risking sincerity. "I am Marwyn's man from Old Town. We have heard of a certain phenomenon. We wondered if we might see it. If you can name it," Sansa said. He smiled. "Naming things gives them power," he said. "But I'll hazard one. You have a dead man in armor who walks and serves. We would like to know whether he breathes." Brienne's hand twitched toward her sword. The Tarly lad flinched. Sansa looked at the man from Old Town. "And if he does not," she said, "will you write a book about it?" "If he does not," the man said, "I will set a quiet fire in my mind and warm my hands over it for the rest of my days." "You cannot have him," Sansa said. "You cannot cut him. You cannot unmake him. If you want to watch him stand, stand yourself and see what the standing teaches you." "Nemsau." The man's eyes lit, as if she had given him something better than a cut. "Ah," he said softly. "Yes, standing. There is more to standing than most men know." That night there were 3 watchers outside her door. Brienne, who watched the world. The White Knight, who watched nothing and so watched everything. And Sansa herself, who woke twice and listened to the silence and made sure it sounded like their own. The fire in the hearth had sunk to a bed of coals like a city seen from a hill at midnight. Glow enough to know the world had not ended. No show to make you think it easier than it was. Toward dawn, a wind rose that spoke from out past the wall. It had a different taste, iron and something like old bone. The snow at the arrow slits did not stick, it cut. Sansa felt the shift in her bones, the way a mare feels a weather change. She rose and dressed quickly, and stepped into the corridor. The White Knight turned his helm toward her, and then toward the stairs as if telling her, "There's news, and it comes from down." There was. A man had ridden his pony to its knees at the gate. He was blue to the lips, and his hands had to be pried from the reins where they had frozen to the leather. He carried no heraldry, but the smell of the sea clung to him like a disease. They brought him to the hall and poured broth into him, and he spoke in the broken way a cup speaks when it has been cracked and mended and cracked again. "Dead that are not dead," he said. "Not like your white man. Wronger. I. They come down river on the floes, men from boats that went through the ice, and some stand up again where they wash ashore. They go where they smell heat. We built a ring of fire. We do not have enough wood for all the rings we will need. Dow. Sansa listened, and her belly went cold in a way the air never could make it. She looked at Brienne and saw in her eyes the knowledge they had tried not to say out loud, because saying things gives them power. Brienne nodded once, as if receiving the last piece of a map. Send men, Sansa said to the captain. Not many, not few. Enough to pull living men out of cold water and to put fire where it needs putting. Prepare to take in those that come. Open the granaries and make a record of every grain that leaves, and let the record be read aloud at supper, so men know where it goes. And wake the smith. I want iron. Many spikes, the captain asked. Chains, Sansa said. Gates never loved a chain more than they will love one this year. She turned to Strong then. It felt wrong to address him with men about. She wanted to speak to him in the language of the corridor, but they would need to learn that a white cloak could be spoken to in public, and not make a mockery of a lady's sense. You will go with them, she said. Not because you are swift, but because you endure. You will put yourself where the cold is thickest and make a hole in it with your body. Men will shelter in that hole until they can stand on their own, and then you will move and make another. Do you understand? The helm inclined. And when you meet what is not dead, she asked. He did not move. Good, she said. Wait for Brienne. I will go, Brienne said. There was relief in it, and dread, and a thing between, which is what courage is made of. When they had gone, the hall felt too large for those that remained. Qyburn came up out of shadow like a secret entrusted to the wrong friend. He inclined his head. You mean to set him against winter? He said almost dreamily, as if fascinated by the fit of it. I mean to set him where a wall would be if we had enough stone, Sansa said. He regarded her. You are not like her, he said. He might as well have said her name. It had hung between them since the gate had first creaked. You think walls are made of promises. She believes promises are made of walls. She was wrong, Sansa said, and surprised herself with how little bitterness there was left in the words. You should go, she added. You should find a corner and sharpen your quills and take the measure of your soul, if there is paper long enough. He smiled that half smile again. I will be of use, he said. You already have been, Sansa said, and he did not know if it was praise or indictment, which suited her. When Brienne returned at dusk of the next day, she smelled of smoke so deep it had sunk through her armor to her skin. Strong returned with her. White cloak grayed with ash, plates flecked in places with something like frost, and something like soot. They came to the hearth without ceremony, and men cleared a space because without knowing it, they had learned in one day what a white cloak meant when it belonged to a lady of the north. Room given without bowing, respect without idolatry. Brienne sat and held her hands to the fire, and told her tale as if she were reciting a ledger. A boat had gone to pieces under the weight of ice and grief. Men had made a ring of flame with oil and desperation, and held it with screams. Things had risen that wore the shapes of men, and moved as if memory were a string tugging them. Iron and fire had spoken the only languages they understood. Strong had walked into the ring and taken 3 men out, not by heroics, but by being where heat was and not needing it. He had stood in the doorway of a fisher's hut while the roof burned down, and held it up with his shoulders until the last child was carried out, and then he had stepped aside and let it fall. Brienne said this last with something in her voice that made Sansa think of awe. The right kind. Not worship, not fear, but the recognition of a thing fitted to its work. And the other things? Sansa asked. We burned them, Brienne said. And the ones we did not burn, we broke with iron and dragged to the fire. Sansa looked at Strong, and if there had been a man within, he might have held up his hands and looked at them as men do when they have done a monstrous and necessary task and wonder what the hands are now. He stood, blank and sturdy and ash-dusted, and Sansa felt the room settle around him, as if it had found a pillar it had not known it needed. That night she went out alone again to the yard and let the snow take the heat from her face. She thought of vows, old and new, She thought of how men had sworn and broken, and how women had invented ways to bind without the words ever making it to a sept. She thought of a white cloak at a northern lady's shoulders, and how that would look. She thought of a child to be born in deep winter, who would never know that once ladies' safety had been made into a game men played for pride. She turned when she sensed him. "Sir Robert," she said. And then, because she was weary of having to make men into the things she needed them to be with her own voice, she said instead, The helm cocked. Red leaves rode the air and stuck to the seam of the gorget. The heart tree watched with its old patient pain. "We will make a house out of what other people threw away," she said softly. "We will make a wall out of a man who was used as a blade. We will make a law out of a vow that meant something once and will mean something again if I make it mean it. You will teach men how to stand, and I will teach them how to stay." She did not know if he heard her, and that was a relief. It freed her to craft her words to please the tree and herself. The night took them and held them, as if memorizing the lines for a play it would perform back to her at some future hour when she faltered. In the weeks that followed, letters came and were answered, and carts came groaning, and were unloaded and put to rest under sheds that had been mended twice since summer. A woman from Barrowton brought a book of winter tales written in a hand as old as anyone's grandmother, and Sansa read to the children while the white knight stood in the corridor beyond the heavy door, and the sound of her voice made its way to him in little threads. The men from Old Town tried to frighten Keyburn by calling him names, and he smiled and asked for ink. The Tarly boy learned to laugh without apology, and to sit without flinching when a blade was set down on the table near his knee. Strong stood and stood and stood. Once, when the snow had crusted so hard that a man's boot could not break it without respect, Sansa took the white cloak herself and cleaned it with fresh fallen flakes until it looked less like ash and more like a promise. She laid it out in her chamber and found to her surprise that she had begun to love it. Not the man, not the thing inside, not the history it had carried with it from a city that had tried to make her into a song and ended by teaching her to think. The cloak. She loved the way it held the light and gave none back it did not choose to return. She loved the way it turned each mark into a record rather than a stain. She loved that other hands had made it now, northern hands that pricked and bled. She loved that the fur at its hem had come off a beast that would have killed a man if he had approached it without honor. She shook it once, and the air filled with whiteness. And as it settled, she found herself smiling at nothing, as a woman does when she remembers that survival can be something more than the absence of dying. Outside, the wind changed again. It smelled of farther snows. The ravens muttered in their sleep. Deep to the north, a blue the color of hammered steel was being forged thicker, and men and things that had once been men were moving. Winterfell made its noises. A white knight stood by a lady's door, and a lady slept with her hand under her cheek, like a child who has learned the trick of sleeping, even when she knows the house holds ghosts. The morning after, a rider came whose horse fell in the yard. The moment it smelled shelter, the rider slid from the saddle and fell too, and said two names Sansa had not said in a very long time in the same breath. One name belonged to a mother and one to a monster. The word struck her like a thrown cup. She steadied, because she was a woman who had learned not to break. And she said, "Tell me," and the rider told her, and her breath made a sound that was not a sob and not a laugh, but something both. Later, after orders had been given, and men had been fed, and a map had been weighted with tankards to keep its corners from curling, she went back to the Godswood and found Strong there, though she had not told him to keep that watch. He stood with his back to the tree, as if he understood that sometimes the thing that requires guarding is the thing you cannot see with eyes. Red leaves had stuck to his shoulder again, and she reached up without thinking and plucked one free. Her fingers brushed the enamel and came away cold. "We will go south," she said to him, because the message required that word, and she had never thought to say it this year. Not by choice. Not forever. just enough to break a thing that thinks itself unbreakable. The helm did not move. "We will carry winter with us," she said. And when she turned away, the snow began again, slow and careful, as if someone somewhere were shaking a sieve over the sky. "Oh, Hundi." The rider had drunk enough broth to put color in his mouth, but not enough to bring it back to his fingers. He told his tale slow, like a man who feared words would shatter if pushed too fast. Men with hoods had taken lordlings with trout and towers on their cloaks and hung them in their own apple trees, while a singer plucked and counted the beats. Behind the singer, a woman watched with a throat like a seam that had been opened and closed again by a poor hand. When the rope stopped swinging, the singer had said, "The Riverlands remembers," and then someone had said a name the rider would not say in the hall because he had not been given leave. He said it to Sansa later in the passage that led to the back stair, in a whisper that fogged the air for a moment, and then went thin. He said her mother's name, and another name that had become a story. And Sansa felt the sound strike bone. The two names did not belong side by side. They had never belonged. If the old gods had wanted them together, they would have carved both into the same red leaf and let it fall in the same season. But the world does not look to leaves when it makes its decisions. She slept sitting up for an hour with her boots on and woke with her cheek stiff against the stone, as if the castle had refused to be a pillow. She rose and dressed and went to the yard and told them. There was not much to tell. Names. The place by the crossroads where all roads in the Riverlands pass. They sooner or later, like a knot in a rope that men wear smooth with their hands. An appeal that was not written and still had the weight of a seal. "Come." The captain did not argue when she said she would go. He had a daughter whose hair was the color of barley, and whose eyes were too big for her winter face. Men with daughters argue less with ladies who have learned to be women among men. "You will take 20, he said. "No more. Not if you mean to move fast. Hillmen for the cold, and Serwyn for sense. 2 bows that can hit a button on your sleeve at 50 paces. Podrick, because he will soon learn to shoot if he has not." He glanced at Brienne when he said that, and Brienne made the small movement that means she has already made the boy practice until his fingers ache. "And him," Sansa said, and there was no glance at Strong because he was a fact in the corridor like Winter, and needs no pointing. "And Clyburn," she added, and when the captain opened his mouth she lifted one hand, and he closed it again. "If there is a thing to be watched, I will have its watcher where I can see him. And if I leave him here with ink enough, he will make the ink into a river and drown my kitchen in notions." Bentro. Clyburn accepted the condition as if it were praise. He packed, slowly, and with neatness, as if false teeth, and knives, and little pots of things that did not declare themselves were a woman's wedding clothes. By noon the gatehouse had kissed its iron teeth back into their sheath, and they were a line on the white road. Men and a woman and a thing in white that men would call a man because it kept their talk clean. The wind came from the north as if to pull at their backs and say, Where? The sky was the bright hammered blue that makes every breath count, and every sound seem small beside it. The first day taught the 20 who did not know that the white night made a good windbreak. Men did not like to walk behind him at first, because it made them feel like boys who need to hide behind their mother's skirts. By evening, they had learned that a man sleeps warmer when he sleeps on the lee side of a wall that does not go to sleep. They did not say the word grateful. The North says other words and lets grateful be seen in the neatness of a man's pack when he takes his turn at watch. They took the King's Road because even men who mean to make new ways still step into old bootprints when they can. The way south was full of little proofs that war had been a thing men had learned as easily as breathing and forgotten only as far as the edges of their fields. A gallows without a rope. A field where the stubble sat in rows, with a gap where a dead man's body had been dragged and then trampled until the gap became part of the pattern. A stone millpost half buried in the drift with the old king's name rubbed down by hands that had meant only to clean it, once upon a time, and now had no king to pretend with. At night, when men huddled and the sky pricked out its old implacable map, Sansa paced the length of their small camp with Brienne, and then alone. She counted the sounds. The whicker and rustle of the horses as they blew steam into each other's noses. The soft clack of a man's teeth that he could not master. The thick silence that meant Strong had taken 3 steps, and then another 3, and then stood and would stand. She had learned to think while walking, and to let the walking burn off the panic that sometimes rose like a fever. In the city, walking had been a way to get from one danger to the next. On the road, walking was a way to keep danger that had no feet from catching up with you. Once, she woke at the moment before dawn when the world decides whether to be blue a little longer or to admit to light. She lay still and listened, and heard the snow shift where it had crusted, a faint brittle hush, and then the small click of metal on metal, as if a bird had pecked a gauntlet. She rose and opened her cloak, and the cold entered like a guest that knows the house very well and needs no invitation. Strong stood where he always did, at the edge of the camp, between their fire that had died to red and the white world that did not care. The wind had taken red leaves 2 days' travel ago and pressed them to his shoulder, and they had frozen there and then broken and fallen and left the faintest rusty mark on the enamel, like dried blood. She reached out and brushed at it with her glove until it faded, and for a heartbeat she wanted to say, "Stay where you are," as if he were a dog, and she were a girl who needed a dog to be kind. She did not say it. She had resolved not to teach herself false comforts anymore. On the 4th day, they crossed a stream that had decided to be glass. Brienne walked first, with a pole, and tapped and learned the ice's mood. Men followed with boots that had learned humility. In the middle, the ice gave a groan like an old woman whose bones are being set. A young flint laughed to make the sound into a joke, and the ice took offense and sank him to the knee. Before his oath had finished leaving his mouth, Strong's hand had plucked him up by the collar like a hen, and set him down on sound ice without the least show of effort. The boy made a noise as if he had had his breath knocked out by gratitude. And later, when they made camp, Sansa saw him loop a thong from his boot to Strong's cloak, hem and back again, and then cut the thong, and keep the piece that had touched the white. Children in the north like talismans as much as old men do. The road bent through pines that kept their own counsel, and then into open where a line of men with spears and bones had once stood and then fallen. There were old stakes with rag ends of flesh where a raven had eaten fine. Someone had planted a signpost and written with chalk and charcoal, first in a laughing hand, and then, below, in a different, angrier hand. Under the branch that pointed west toward the Mummers' Ford, someone had scrawled, "No mummers." Under the sign that pointed east to Fairmarket, someone else had written, "No fair." Men who walk in fear write jokes into wood because it is a way to think themselves cleverer than hunger. Toward the end of the first week, they came to the inn at the crossroads. It had burned once and been rebuilt and burned again, and then learned its lesson and been rebuilt with less pride. The sign creaked as it always had, the painted king's crown now a smear of brown like an old bruise. There were men under the eaves who had too many teeth and one who had none and smiled anyway. Inside, the common room held warmth like a hoard. The wench was not young and wore her hair as if hair were an ally, not a fashion. She had a scar along one cheek, thin and white as a chalk line. She looked at Sansa's cloak and nodded as if to a woman who had made the same bargain with winter. "White," she said under her breath when Strong ducked under the lintel, and then louder, to the room. "Because an innkeeper's voice is law in a small kingdom. White out of the wind. You'll do your standing outside if it's all the same to my floor." Strong stood outside. He might have stood in the hearth fire and not charred. But there was no need to frighten a room already full of men who had learned to put knives down when they drank. Brienne took a bench against the wall and ate beef that had seen too much smoke and a heel of bread that had seen too little salt. Podrick sat beside her with his legs tucked as if his knees were ashamed of taking space. Sansa sat with her back to the room and watched the room anyway in the old way, in the bottom of her mug, in the black window, in the reflection of the fire in a dull spoon someone had polished with their sleeve. The songs were wrong. That is how she knew the men at the next table had seen the Brotherhood. They sang the Maiden's Lament to a marching cadence. They sang the Dornishman's wife without any of the laughter you need to carry the filth. She said as much to Brienne in a voice low as a needle dropped in straw. And Brienne's hand found the table's edge and rested there lightly, as a swordswoman's hand rests on a pommel, when she is telling herself she is not yet going to take her blade out of its house. They found them beyond the inn where the road dropped toward the ford, and the trees knitted low, and the air smelt of oak rot and wet iron. They were not hiding, not as men hide. They were standing in the road as if they had a right by some old charter no one had seen. A man with a too-yellow beard and a nose broken as many times as it takes for a man to stop thinking it matters, sat on a boulder with his boots in the muck. He strummed, not hard, and spoke while his fingers kept the tune from rotting entirely. "Lady," he said, and lady's shadow. He glanced past Brienne at Strong and then away, as if looking too long at a white wall made a man forget what rooms are for. "We wondered if you would take the small trouble of turning aside." "Tom," Brienne said like a warning. So she knew him. Of course she knew him. The road has only so many songs. Tom Seven Strings. Tom of 7 ways to make a kindness into cruelty, and then back into kindness if a girl smiled. He looked older and did not look better for it. "I have taken bigger troubles for less," Sansa said. "True," he said cheerfully. "And now, a little trouble for a big something." He plucked a cord that had the shape of a threat, and then made it into a jest with the next. "You can smell it, can't you? The river has swallowed too many secrets, and they are lying in its belly making gas." "Take me," Sansa said, and Brienne took in breath sharp as frost. "Not as a hostage, not as a prize. Take me because if she is what you say, then I am owed this sight, and it owes me." Tom looked at Brienne, and then at the cloak at Sansa's throat, as if he could not make the two belong to one woman. "Swords," he said softly, and Brienne's hand went to her hilt, as if the word had found an old door inside her and opened it without knocking. "You have a choice," Tom said, and grinned to make it sound worse. "Follow or be followed." They followed. The path was not a path. It was a suggestion of movement along the river's fringe, where the old flood marks made black freckles up the trunks. Men stepped where other men stepped, and so made a pattern out of a tangle. The white night made no sound, and the white made the green look sour and the brown look older. Birds went silent when they passed. Birds who live by filching know what a mouth that cannot eat looks like. They came at last to a grove of alders, where some old fire had scorched the low branches and left a smell that remembered pitch. There were men there, and one woman, and a feeling that had nothing to do with men. Brienne stopped, and then did not. Sansa went on until the ground told her to halt, until the mud sucked once at her boot and let go as if in acknowledgement. She stood and did not bow. She had bowed too much in her girlhood, and it had not saved anything worth saving. The hood did not fall back at once. The woman under it had learned to be careful of the air on what had happened to her throat. When it did fall, there were men who looked away because shame is stronger than curiosity in those that have not sold it for coin. Sansa did not look away. The face was her own in certain lights, with the nose a little stronger, and the mouth a little narrower, and the eyes that had taught her how to look at a baby and see father and mother both. The throat was what it was, sewn by a butcher in a poor light with a dull needle. The skin had gone the color of a winter pear kept too long, translucent and wrong. She did not feel horror. The horror had happened already, in a hall with music and knives. Now there was only a grieving that had been taught to walk and could not be taught to lie down. "Mother," Sansa said. The men around them shifted as if they had felt a stone drop into a well and were waiting for the splash. The hooded woman, Caitlin, Lady Stoneheart, River Rumor made flesh, did not speak. Her eyes did a thing Sansa knew, a small narrowing that meant she had weighed what had been said and found the proper measure to answer in the set of her mouth. She lifted a hand and it was hers and not hers. The fingers fine and blunt at the tips, the nails clean and trimmed and the skin the wrong color. She did not come forward. She did not touch. Brienne went to one knee so fast it made the men start. She put her sword out as if to offer it to a fire. "My lady," she said, and her voice broke on the second word, as if it had become a girl's voice under a woman's chest. The hooded woman's head turned a little, that old mother's motion of weighing a daughter's friend and finding her good because the daughter said so. Then the head turned again, and the eyes found the white at the edge of the grove and fixed there. And for the first time since the hood had fallen, something changed in the ruined throat. Not a sound, a movement, like a knot being pulled the wrong way. Tom's fingers found a different tune and kept it soft. "We have a rule," he said into the quiet. "We hang those that need hanging. We follow Our Lady's looks like a map. We don't like priests. We like bread. We like those that like bread. We don't like a certain river crossing very much." "The twins," Sansa said. The word made the air colder. "Phrase." One of the men laughed. A dry crack. "Some call them lords still. Men who salt bread and eat it and cut their own palms on the same knife," Sansa said. And it surprised her that the words did not make her sick. They tasted of iron and old lessons. Men who broke a guest's oaths and turned a hall into a slaughterhouse. Men who made the king's peace into a jest and the mother's mercy into an oath to a butcher. The hooded woman's hand made a motion then that looked like a yes and a no together. Such things are sometimes the only honest answer. The scar at her throat drew and eased, and her eyes went to Sansa's hands where they lay steady on the folds of her cloak. Sansa spread her fingers, as if to show there was no blood on them now, and had been once when she pricked them on a seam. "I came," Sansa said, "because I will not let a tale of you grow in my yard without seeing if it is a weed I should pull, or a tree I should shelter. I came because these men would make your looks into a law, and I will not have another law in my life spring from a look alone. I came because there is a crossing that needs to learn what breaking is, and I am a Stark, and I have winter and men and iron and a sword that is not mine but is sworn to me. I came because if you are my mother, you will know that I mean to do this without turning myself into the sort of story that is told by men that leave girls in the ashes of inns." Now, the men stirred at that because they had told such stories, and their faces remembered it. The woman in the hood looked at Brienne again, and then at Sansa, and then at the white, and something like a shudder went through her. She stepped forward one pace and lifted her hand and let it hover over the place where Strong's heart would be if a man were inside. Her fingers did not touch the white. They trembled, and then steadied, and then dropped. Sansa thought, "She knows what we have done. She knows we have both taken a body and made it into a promise. And hers was a better promise when she was alive, and mine is the only one I could get. Will you march with me?" Sansa asked. "To the twins? Not as my bannerman and not as my conscience. As winter and river together." The woman's head moved once. Consent or calculation, Sansa could not say. Perhaps the two are cousins. They camped that night on the edge of the grove with the river's breath crawling into their blankets. The Brotherhood kept their own watch and let Strong keep his. Men told old jokes in low voices that made them sound like prayers. Tom tuned and retuned his strings as if the air were a lyre. Qyburn sat on a stump and regarded the hooded woman with the bright, avid respect of a child looking at a strange animal, and Sansa went and stood over him so the shadow of her body cut his line of sight. "You have seen enough," she told him. "What is left is mine." "I have not taken anything," he said, hands open. "You live by taking things and making them into words," she said. "Leave this one as it is. If you write it down, the ink will believe it owns her." He inclined his head and looked away with the grace of a man who accepts he has been kept alive a little longer to learn how to be better. Brienne came to sit beside Sansa with a bowl of something that the men called soup, because it moved, and she called water, because it did not. She did not speak for a while. When she did, it was to speak to the dark, as one does when there are too many ears and none of them kind. "My vows," she said. "I made them to a lady, and then I made them again to her, and then again. How many vows can a sword keep before it's just a stick in a man's hand?" "You made them to the same thing," Sansa said. "You made them to the idea that a woman's life is not a place where men should wipe their boots. You made them to the notion that words mean something when we say them under trees and in halls. That idea is here, Brian. It is here, and it is there. She nodded toward the hooded shape under the alder, and then toward her own chest. It is not less true because a throat has been ruined. It is not more true because mine is not. Brienne made a noise that might have been assent, and might have been grief. She will want blood, she said. She will have it, Sansa said, and the calm in her voice startled her until she realized it had been sitting in her chest all afternoon waiting to be let out. Not because she wants it, because it is owed. And mercy? Brienne asked. I will keep it, Sansa said, and she touched the hilt at Brienne's side lightly, and Brienne covered Sansa's hand with her own and then let go. In the morning, the river made low talk with itself, as if rehearsing. They moved. The Brotherhood moved in their way, along hedges and under hollies, appearing where no one would think to look for men with ropes. Sansa's 20 moved in their way, in a line that made sense and could be counted. Strong moved as he always did, unbothered by slope or thicket, the white of him unreasonable among willow catkins and alder buds that had the folly to think spring might be persuaded by a week of weak sun. The twins rose in the distance like two tired eyes that did not blink. Smoke went up from within their lids. Cold daylight did the cruel thing it always does, and put every flake of mortar and every gobbet of ice in honest relief. Men in the Riverlands say that a man who wishes to be a lord without having to be worthy of it should build a bridge and then block it. Walder Frey had made the lesson into a house. Banners flapped on the towers, twins on gray. The drawspan was up, the river thick around the piers, and thinner in the eddies where a bold duck might think to paddle and be wrong. Sansa said nothing for a long time. She let the sight be itself. She listened to what the air said as it passed along the buttresses, that the mortar had been patched and patched again, and that hands had shaken as they worked. She smelled what the wind brought down. Old frying fat and straw that had seen too many bodies, and a reek like men who sleep with fear as a second wife. In the old days she would have tried to imagine herself inside those walls, and then thought of a song that would make the shape of her fear smaller. Now she let the fear be. It was a thing at her side. It kept pace. It did not pull. Tom came up and stood, his boots planted in the frost. Pretty, he said, because a man like Tom cannot help himself. Ugly, Sansa said. Ugly like a scar that a boy thinks looks like a man's story. Ugly then, Tom agreed quite happily. You would be surprised what breaks ugly. Sometimes a song, sometimes hunger, sometimes a girl who has learned to count. He pointed with his chin. Men moved along the parapet like ants that have been taught to wear leather. The gates were shut tight, as if the Freys believed the river itself might try to come in. In the water below, ice had mounded, and then broken, and then mounded again, a model of war in white. Brienne murmured numbers under her breath. She was counting slits and men, and the places where a thing too large to be a man might be made to fit. She was good at such arithmetic. Sansa watched her count, and then let her own mind count other things. The number of women inside who were not Freys, but would be treated as if they were if the wrong men broke the wrong doors. The number of boys who would die making glories of themselves if she made this into a song. You cannot starve them, Qyburn said without being asked, because he had measured the place in his mind long before. They have stores, they have fear, and fear keeps better than grain if you salt it right. You will need a thing that turns fear into panic. Fire. Someone behind them ventured. A young man whose father had been killed at the Red Wedding because he had believed a knife in a feast was like a joke in a song. Cruel but not mortal. Fire eats both sides of a bridge if you let it, Brienne said. And fire is a better friend to those that do not mind screaming. Water then, said the young man stubbornly. Drown rats. The river is theirs until it is everyone's, Sansa said. She looked at Strong, who stood with his white cloak taking the half-light and holding it. The gate? She asked Brienne. Thick oak, Brienne said. Iron bands. Hinged well. The right blow might lift a bar if the men inside were fools enough to stand on it. They are not. They have learned that lesson. The Brotherhood did not wait for a plan that could be written down and put under a rock for safekeeping. That is not how they fought. They told stories between themselves of a thing that had been done at Stone Mill, where ropes had been turned into bridges, and men had walked where they had no business walking. They pointed. They showed. They had a way of making a scheme out of all the small uses men put to their hands when plows are broken and soldiers are not yet at the door. Knots, pulleys, a washerwoman's patience, a poacher's boldness. Sansa listened to all of it, and then made a different set of rules in her head. She needed one door open. Not 10. One span lowered. Not the whole road. She needed to slip Winter into a place built for guests and make it used to her own. She turned to Strong, which is to say she turned to a piece of Winter that had learned to walk and wear a cloak. There are places where the river is thinner under the ice, she said. Not at the middle. At the very edge where the water pretends to be still. If you put your weight there and stayed, would the ice hold? He turned his helm a fraction toward the water and a fraction back. He made no motion to indicate a test or an unwillingness. He was built to take weight and give none back. In a better world, men would put such a gift under a bridge in spring to keep boys from falling in. In this world, she would put it to Winter's use. You will go down in the twilight hour, she said. Not yet, when men are most alive with fear, nor in the night, when things unseen are blamed. In the hour when men yawn and wives light fires for bread, you will go into the river up to your thighs where it looks strong and is weak. You will stand. You will take a rope about your chest. So will 3 men. You will not move unless the rope pulls twice, and it will not pull twice because that is the signal to move. It will pull once only when you are seen by the men on the wall, and they have begun counting the ways to make a story of you. The rope will be on a block and men in the reeds will take the strain until it sings. When it sings, the men at the other end, she nodded at the Brotherhood's best, will leap, and the rope will become a bridge and fools will put their hands on it to push it away, and then other fools will lay their bodies on it to pull it close, and then I will know which of the fools need to be spared and which must be killed. Do you understand? He did the small inclination that meant yes and no at once. He understood what she had said, and he understood that understanding had not changed the world. Brienne's mouth had thinned as she listened, because she knew what the rope would do to flesh if a man fell, and another man would not let go. You will lose men, she said. I already have, Sansa said. I lose a man every time a boy thinks breaking a thing is the same as making a life. I would lose fewer if I teach them to break so a life can be made of what is left. We could go to White Harbor, Podrick said, brave and slightly breathless. His fingers worried the fletching of an arrow until it looked like a wet bird. Ask for boats, and be turned away by ice and pride, Sansa said gently. We are here now. The river is here now. The men inside are the same men who wiped their knives on their sleeves and counted how long it takes a song to stop when the singers are bleeding. We will not sing to them from the bank. The hooded woman had made no sound and no motion. Sansa felt her like a temperature at her back. Tom's hands were quiet. Men had stopped making suggestions and begun to look at each other as men do when they have been told how something will be, and must decide whether to be brave inside their boots or out loud with their mouths. The young Flint, the one Strong had plucked from the stream, tied and retied the thong around his wrist, and when he broke it with his teeth and retied it, his hands had stopped shaking. Qyburn tilted his face to the river and smiled as if he had seen an experiment in an old book come to life. Sansa turned and met his eyes until the smile went away. He was useful and terrible, and hers to command and not to trust. They waited. Winter teaches waiting as a virtue and as a test. Brienne went along the line and spoke in low voice to men whose minds were already running ahead. Podrick checked his arrows twice, and then a third time, and then left them alone, because Brienne nodded once, and he had learned that meant stop. Tom slid off into the scrub with 2 men with ropes, and came back with 3 more men, and a grin that meant he had made mischief and would speak of it later. Strong stood and was a piece of the white day. At the hour, Sansa had said, the light lost its courage a little. You could see farther for a moment, and then not as far, and in that moment, men think of bread and small jokes. She nodded and the rope went around Strong's chest and under his arm and under again. The hemp rasped on the enamel, a hard sound that made the men on the rope flinch because they could feel it under their hands and imagined it under their skin. 3 men looped their own ropes, the Brotherhood's men, small and quick and quiet-footed. Brienne checked the knots with hands that had learned their work on men's lives, and then looked into Sansa's face for a heartbeat as if she might say, "Girl?" But Sansa was not a girl and did not need to be told. They went. Strong went first into the water like a pillar being put into the earth. The ice cracked under him in a line like a seam opening, and then did not give. He sank to his thighs and held. The river came up around his plates and lapped at his white, as if tasting to see if there were anything to eat. The men went after, roping to one another, finding the thin edge and stamping a shelf into it with their boots, in a rhythm that sounded like a silly dance, if you did not know what it was to do it with death under the next step. On the parapet, men pointed. Fools called out. You can tell men who are about to do the wrong thing by the way they shout before they act. Some laughed. Others did the counting in their heads with their lips moving. The number of heartbeats a man in armor can stand in winter water. The number of strides a rope makes into a ladder. The number of men one rope can carry before it snaps and makes a story for the sons of those that live. The rope began to sing. Sansa felt the song under her feet. It came up the grass blade by blade and into her boots. She nodded once. The men in the rushes rose like snipe and flew, and the rope became taut in a scream, and then settled into a straight that made the world align for a breath. A man leapt and did not fall. Another leapt and did not. A third put a knee into another's back and skinned it, and then was himself dragged level by hands that were not gentle and not kind, and very necessary. Strong held. The white did not change. The river did what rivers do, and carried the news along itself, to a bend where a fisherman stood with his face to the wind, and thought he had seen a line cast by a god. On the parapet, men put hands to the rope and tried to push it away, because that is what men do when they see a thing coming. They did not invite. They grunted. They might as well have pushed at a winter night. Other men flung grapnels, and one hit a man in the shoulder, and the man cursed sweetly, and then went on, and the sweet and the curse made the man on the wall flinch. Arrows pecked. 2 men in the water ducked without meaning to, and came up gaping like carp, and went on because hands hauled them. A stone dropped where a head had been, and hit Strong's shoulder, and bounced and left a mark like a thumbprint on the white. Brienne had a bow in her hand, and no one knew when she had found it. She loosed, and an archer on the wall put his hand to his face, and sat down without fuss, as if he had decided to weep but been too polite to do it standing. Podrick's arrow went wide, and then the next went less wide, and the third took a man in the meat of his arm, and Podrick's face lit with a startled dignity, and he nodded as if to a teacher. The first of the Brotherhood's men found the buttress. He scrambled and clawed and bled a little, and then vanished into a shadow, and did not come out where any man could see. The rope went slack, and then taut, and then sang again, and Sansa said to Brienne without looking away, "Stop them from shooting." Brienne lifted her hand, and 5 men rose from the ditch behind them where they had sunk themselves like stones, and sent a small storm upward that made men on the wall duck and swear and then duck again, and forget to swear. Sansa turned her face to the high gate and thought, "You are wood and iron and men with bad dreams. I am winter and river and hunger, and a girl who has learned that the door will open if you push where the hinges are." Inside, something clanked. There is a music to panic. It is not like any other. It is not like battle, which is a drum. It is not like feasting, which is a lie. It is a sequence of wrong notes. Dropped keys. A bar shouted. A man stumbling over his own foot and blaming a ghost. The music came to them faint and toothy through the gate, and Sansa felt a little pity, and put it away, and kept the part that would help her not to kill a woman with a baby, because a man had done her harm. The bar lifted. Not because panic had lifted it. Panic is not that good. Because a man, 2 men, 3 who had judged the moment and thought, "I will go out and make a name in the snow," and had pulled at the wrong instant. The span lowered a hand's breadth, and then jerked, and then settled, and then came down the way a stubborn child sits when a mother's patience finally makes itself known. Men roared. Roars sound foolish in cold air. They go up and turn to steam, and then to crystals, and then fall on the roarer's own head. Sansa did not roar. She stepped forward. Brienne was 3 steps ahead, sword out, her mouth a hard line, her eyes a blue that would look kind in summer and now cut. Strong moved, and the rope that was around him went slack, and then was cast off, and fell and lay on the ice like a tired snake. He went up onto the span, and his white cloak took the first black smears of men's hands as they reached, without thinking, for something solid. She went into a house built for betrayal and did not feel herself become a betrayer. She felt only the cold and the weight of the fur at her throat, and the press of half-seen figures along the sides as men who had thought themselves safe made themselves small. A boy gaped at her, hair sticking up from sleep and terror. And she looked at him and put her hand out with the palm down, that old motion you make for a nervous hound, and his mouth closed. A woman with a baby turned her face so her cheekbone made a shadow. Sansa tilted her head as if she and the woman had been at market together once, and the woman, without knowing why, moved aside and made a space where men in winter could pass and not bruise her child. At the inner gate, they found the first Frey, who thought he was still the sort of man his father had told him he would be. He had a fine beard and a stupid mouth and a surcoat with fresh paint on it. He raised his sword in a way that said he had been taught by a cousin in a yard once, and remembered the lesson because it had come with wine. Brienne took his blade out of his hand and gave it back to him hilt first, and then made the smallest cut along his cheek, so he would remember, and he sat down and began to cry as if he had found at last the song that had been stuck behind his teeth. More men came. Strong stepped where oppress was worst. The white of him did the thing it had been made to do in a city where fear and power had been married by a man. With a chain he'd won with words instead of service. He did not kill without need. He was a wall and a wedge and a threat you could lean on. A man struck him with an axe that had a chip out of it, and Strong took the blow on his pauldron and pushed, and the man fell as if a door had opened behind him, and he had not known it would. Another stabbed at the slit in the helm, as if the gods had put it there to invite ineptitude. Strong turned his head half a degree, and the point skated and cracked, and the man sucked his finger when his own blade nicked him. Sansa moved through it, and wherever she moved, men looked at her face, and saw something that made them stop telling the story they had been telling themselves, and start listening to a story they did not know yet. The hall was high and mean. It had been built to impress small men, and to make big men bow their heads under the beams. The tables had been scrubbed well, and smelled of harsh lie and lies. Along the far wall, on a chain as short as old spite, hung a boy. He could not have been much older than the boys who ran the length of Winterfell's yard for Sansa's amusement, when she needed laughter that did no harm. He wore a cloak with blue above and red below, and a fish that would have been proud if it had not been painted by a cheap hand. He had pissed himself. Sansa looked at him and then away, because looking too long at a child in humiliation is a sort of cruelty, and she had sworn to keep cruelties for men who had earned them. A Frey, with ears that stuck out from his head like handles, blustered forth with a paper in his hand, as if it were armor. He began to speak of law, and Sansa let him speak 2 lines, because law is a thing you do not interrupt if you mean to be its friend later. Then she raised her hand, and he faltered, and then he stopped. "You will take me," she said, "where the one who calls himself Lord is. If he is too old to stand, you will bring me a chair to his chair. If he is too young to understand, you will bring me his mother. If he is too brave to feel shame, you will bring me his dead." "Who are you?" he said. But he did not say it like a man who does not know. He said it like a man who hopes the answer is a name he has not heard. "I am the lady of this winter," Sansa said. And the words felt less like a boast than like telling a child his own name. "I am Sansa Stark, daughter of the woman your house murdered, and the man your house betrayed. And the north you think you can stand astride like a bridge." The paper shook. It made a tiny crisp sound. He turned, as men turned to men behind them when they wish someone else would take the blame, and found that Strong and Brienne had put themselves where men had thought to be, and that Tom had put his boots on the table, and was eating someone else's bread with the cheerful sacrilege of a man who has made peace with how gods work. They brought the Lord. He was not Walder. Old men do not outlast the mean streak in their lines forever. He was one of the grayer sons, or the son of such a son. a narrow man with a narrow brow, and hands softened by a life of reaching for what other men had gotten. He took a seat and tried not to show relief, and failed. "You cannot," he began, and Sansa raised her hand again, and he stopped because at last someone had taught him when to stop. He was not completely useless. "I can," she said, "and I will." The Red Wedding. The men in the hall flinched, some from pride, some from the stoppage in that name like a bone in a throat. Was a sin against more than men. It was a sin against the way houses live in a world that would rather they died. "I will not kill you to prove that I can make a house die. I will make you into something you will not like, and then you will live with it, and that will be harder for you." Now. He stared as if she had thrown an egg, and it had not broken. "You will pull down your banners," she said, "and you will hang in their place white linen with no device on it for a month of days." "A month," Tom murmured in delight. "There's a pretty number. And when men ask you who you are, you will say, 'We are a house without a name, until we have earned one.' And men will laugh, and then they will stop laughing, because they will smell the truth on you. You will give up the bridge for a year and a day, and let men pass in peace on boats and rafts, and you will not take coin for it, and you will count the lost coin in your bed at night, and wish to die of it, and you will not. You will give up the child on that chain, and 100 more sons of men who have not yet learned to talk, and you will send them north and east and west as fosters to houses that remember what it was to be men. And they will come back in 10 years and take your seats, and you will call them Lord and my Lady, and you will hate it and live. For those you killed, you will feed 10 families through the winter without asking their names or their God. You will hang those of your house that took joy in the killing. Bring me names, and if you bring me the wrong ones will hang, and then the right, and you will learn to tell the difference in haste." Now, the man's mouth worked. "And if we do not," he managed, and it came out like a boy testing whether a father will actually strike. "Then the river will learn how to eat oak," Sansa said, and the quiet in her voice sent a stir along the benches. "Then the bridge will learn how to carry white down it instead of black. Then the men you see in the hedges will come in by the door, and your sons will climb out the windows, and the windows will be too small." He swallowed. He looked at the white cloak and flinched, and then looked past it at Brienne, and flinched again. And then he looked at Sansa, and saw that her face was not fashioned for the pleasure of cruelty, and knew he had met something worse for him than a lord who loved to hear men scream. He saw measure. Men like him do not know what to do with measure. "Who judges me?" he asked, trying cunning. "You? A girl?" "Winter," Sansa said. And the word had weight, because the door behind the hall opened to the river, and the wind came in, and all the men drew breath together like a man waking from a bad dream. They did not break the twins that day. A plan built out of rage makes a poor mason. They made the first necessary things happen, and let the rest bind in their places. The boy on the chain came down and wept, and then did not weep, because Sansa looked at him as if he had made a mistake, and was now stopping. The rope that had been a bridge came off Strong's shoulder and out of the water, and onto the floor in loops like old serpents, and Tom put his foot on it, as if to keep a rhyme from running away. Men whispered and counted, and found that they had lived so far through something they had not seen before. They camped that night on the northern bank where the ground had remembered spring and softened. The hooded woman stood at the edge of the firelight and watched the black shape of the bridge against the sky. She did not move when snow began to fall again. A flake lit on the ragged line of her throat and melted, and ran down in a line like a drop of blood. Sansa watched it without blinking, and then blinked, and the drop had made its way into the collar of the hood, and was gone. Brienne sat with her hands around a cup that had forgotten heat long ago, and spoke once, into the space between them, a word Sansa could not hear, and did not need to. Podrick slept with his mouth open like a child. Qyburn wrote nothing and smiled at nothing, and stared at his hands as if he had found a new vein under the skin that would carry ink. Strong stood. Men drifted by him because men drift by walls, to measure themselves against a thing that does not care. A small boy in a patched cloak came and stood beside him, and did not look up, and did not look away, and merely stood for a long time, because sometimes boys need to prove to themselves They can stand as long as men. When he had stood as long as he could, he put his hand flat on the white enamel, very quickly, and sprang back. And then he laughed once, a tiny bark, as if he had stolen something, and no one had noticed. He ran away. Strong did not move. Sansa lay on her cloak and looked up through the tent's slit at the little circle of sky. The stars were fierce and close, as if she might have cut her hand on one if she reached. She did not sleep. She did not plan. She let the images come and go. A rope singing. A man sitting down to cry because his cheek had been made to tell the truth. A woman's hood a little white at the edge where frost had settled. A white cloak smudged black and then brushed clean by snow, like forgiveness given by weather, not by men. In the morning, ravens argued on the parapet, offended to find men had become interesting again. The day had decided to be gray. Gray is honest. You cannot make it into a ballad. Sansa rose and went to the bank and stood with her hands behind her, and her breath streaming like a small flag. Strong came and stood where he always did, where a wall would have been if there were a wall. "You will be asked," she said without turning, "what you are. You will not be able to answer. That is well. Let others make the mistake of answering. We will do the work." The river spoke to itself. Somewhere, a child laughed the way a child laughs when he hears a dog fart and thinks the world has done him a favor. Men on the bridge slouched and straightened as their surgeons passed and called them pigs. A woman on the southern bank bent over a basin and wrung out cloth with hands that would ache later in the cold. She did not look up. Sansa set her jaw and felt her face become a tool again, one she had learned to use and keep clean. She thought of winter, and of the shape a white cloak made when she threw it over a man who was not a man, and of a hood that hid a mother who was and was not, and of a bridge that would learn its lesson inch by inch. She thought of the north like a flame banked under ash, ready to blow when given air. She thought of justice like iron. Slow to heat and slow to cool. She thought of mercy like bread. "Strong," she said, and the helm turned a fraction. "Stand with me." He did. And for a little while the sound of the river, and the sound of men, and the sound of a white cloak stiffening in new cold made a music that no song could carry, and that would live only as long as they did. And then in other men and women who had not seen this day and would repeat it anyway without knowing why, as people do when they have been taught the shape of something good. They did not storm. They settled. Settling is a kind of storm if you do it right. Sansa sent men to the villages along the muddy lanes, and took back boys that had been taken for surety and girls that had been apprenticed to kitchens that had become cages. She set up a table in a shed with a roof that bowed in the middle and wrote down names until her hand cramped, and then shook it out and wrote them down again, because names are the only way to make the dead into something you can live with. Brienne trained men who thought a blade was a glory into men who knew it was a tool. Tom went along the bank and made songs out of rope and ice that were not very good and very useful. At night, the hooded woman came and went and did what a river does. Found ways. Men who had taken joy in a certain hall vanished and then hung where those men had once told girls to dance. Sansa did not forbid it. She did not order it. She let river and winter do their different works, and held the place where they met in her hands, and did not crush it. Qyburn found Sansa one evening with his cloak dusted white in the folds and his face unusually plain. "There is a thing I could do," he said quietly. "That might make her more herself." "No," Sansa said before he had finished, and the word felt like a gate slamming on a thief. "She is not a toy. She is not a lesson. She is not a question for your books. She is the price some men pay for what they did. Let her be expensive." "I thought you might say so," he admitted, and inclined his head. And she wondered, as one wonders when a fox steps delicately away from a coop he might have tested, whether he had meant to obey even if she had said yes. Brienne brought her a report as a farmer brings a basket, solid and worth the holding. Freys had come to the gate with faces that wished to be brave, and had begun to say words that wished to be law, and had ended up pleading, and then, at the end, promising to send for their cousins. And Brienne had told them they would send for no one and would teach their boys to mend sluice gates and their girls to keep ledgers, and that they would like it because liking it would be the only thing left to do. Some had snarled. Some had nodded. Sansa approved, and then, after Brienne had gone back to her counting, Sansa went and stood under the hooded woman's watching place and told the trees what she had done. Because the trees tell no one but remember, and remembering is the only way the world keeps score. News came, as it does, along the rope of the river, and the leather of boots, and the chatter of birds that do not care what they say. The hill clans had come to Winterfell and eaten without asking, and then asked, and had been told to sit where they were. They had sat and had enjoyed being told. White Harbor had sent grain by oxen prayer. Some oxen had died, and some prayers had been answered, and no one had yet learned which was why the carts had arrived. The faith in the South had learned that a crown without a queen is merely heavy metal. A queen in the South had learned that crowns make poor swimming weights. A black ship had been seen at the mouth of a frozen river with a man upon it, who had laughed when the ice cracked. Sansa put the news in the cupboard in her mind where news goes until it comes out dressed as fact. On the 7th day, a woman came to the northern bank with a pot under her arm, and a child at her skirt, and asked what the white man was. Sansa looked at her and said, "He's a wall." The woman nodded, as if her question had been answered, and went and sat on a stone, and fed her child, and watched the bridge, and did not trouble herself with the thoughts of lords. Snow came, steady, and without spite. The rope lines turned white. The white cloak turned whiter, and then took smoke, and then was brushed clean again by more snow. The twins on their piers looked at last, not like a boast, but like a work that men had to do with care. Sansa stood in it with her hood thrown back because she had decided that if she was to be Winter's lady, she would let it lay hands on her hair. "Mother," she said once, standing where she knew the hooded woman would hear, though she could not tell if she listened. "I will not bring you home. I cannot. You are too much like Winter now, and Winter has its own rooms. But I will bring you a thing that the South has never understood. A law that you can put your hand on, and it will not cut you. If that is not enough, then we will learn together how to make it more." "Now," the river replied in its old tongue. Trees took the snow and held it as if holding it were a way of making a vow. Men on the wall shifted and learned to be ashamed when their eyes lingered on the white too long. A boy in a patched cloak ran by with his arms out, as if he were a bird that could love a winter sky. Strong stood. He did what he had been made to do, which was not the thing he had been made for in the South. He stood where Winter needed standing. He stood where a lady had said stand, and where a mother who could no longer say words had nodded once. And in the space between those two commands, there was a new law being made, slow and sure, as snow makes a roof heavier and steadier, until the day comes when someone must climb up and push, and let some of it fall lest the house break. Sansa watched the house that had pretended it was a bridge, and thought of pushing, and of what would fall, and of what she would keep. The day would come. It always does. For now, she let the pace be slow, and the breath long, and the snow fall. Because there are battles that are won by breathing, and by standing,